Hello, this is Professor Zaldivar, and this is a discussion of Hugo Bedau's essay, The Case Against the Death Penalty. Bedau begins by arguing that the death penalty fails as a deterrent. A punishment can only be a deterrent, he argues, if it is consistent and prompt. But only 1 out of every 33 murderers are eventually sentenced to death. Furthermore, the death penalty takes considerably longer to adjudicate than other crimes. And finally, criminals aren't actually deterred by deterrence. In the last video, we discussed that irrational criminals who are acting or who are committing murder because of an irrational motivation, either a mental derangement, a psychosis, or perhaps just being overwhelmed with emotions at a particular moment, aren't going to be stopped by rational considerations of punishments. But what about rational murderers? If the death penalty stopped them, then maybe it would be worth having. But let's consider their motivations. How does a rational murderer intend to get caught? If the answer is no, he or she intends to commit murder and get away with it, then are they likely to be deterred by a punishment, by any punishment? It seems likely that they won't be deterred by a punishment, no matter how severe it is, because they don't plan to get caught. They don't plan to get punished at all. They think they'll get away with it. What about and notice, it doesn't actually matter whether they're actually smart enough to indeed get away with it, right? Many murderers perhaps commit murder thinking they're going to get away with it and then get caught. But they don't expect to get caught, right? When they're planning, they think they're smart enough to get away with it. Whether they are or not doesn't matter. Considerations of punishment don't enter into the picture anyway. What about murderers who don't plan to get away with it, right? Who intend to commit a murder and then perhaps sit down on the sidewalk and wait for the police to come and arrest them? Well, it seems that these murderers don't care about the punishment. They know they're going to be punished, but they don't care. And there it seems that a punishment, no matter how severe, isn't going to stop them either. So this idea that the death penalty is a successful deterrent seems to not hold water, at least as far as Hugo Bedau considers it. Furthermore, he argues the death penalty is fundamentally unfair, and for some interesting reasons. He notes that the death penalty is applied much more often when the victim is white. He also notes that it's applied much more often for male defendants. And finally, that it is sought much more often for poor defendants. In other words, if you're a poor man, regardless of race, if you are a poor man and commit murder, the prosecutors are much, much, much more likely to try to convict you with the death penalty than if you are a wealthy man or even a poor woman. And if you are a wealthy woman, the odds of someone seeking the death penalty against you are actually fairly low. And perhaps more importantly, or just as importantly, the race of the victim seems to matter. Prosecutors are much more likely to seek the death penalty if the victim is white and not a minority. This is, of course, a fundamentally unfair situation. It means that certain people in our society are more likely to be put to death than others, and that's by definition unfair. Now, you notice you might say, as pro-capital punishment theorists argue, that the death penalty is a fair punishment, and perhaps it just needs to be distributed. It's the distribution that's unfair, not the punishment. Well, that might be so, but until or unless we can make the distribution fair, it seems immaterial to argue that the punishment is fair, right? Doesn't really matter, Poyman would say, that the punishment is fair if it's distributed unfairly then you're still much more likely to die if you kill a white person, and you're still much more likely to be sentenced to capital punishment if you are a poor man. So it doesn't really matter where the unfairness comes in at the level of the punishment or at the level of distribution. The system as it stands now is unjust. Finally, Bedau notes that capital punishment is permanent. That seems like an obvious claim, but if you think about the fact that it's not an effective deterrent and it's fundamentally unfair in who is tried in capital punishment cases, then the fact that it's permanent combines with those two factors to make it seem a particularly difficult policy to endorse. Right? The unfairness of it is magnified by the permanence, and the punishment does not fit the crime. So some people argue in favor of the death penalty by saying the punishment fits the crime. If you commit murder, you deserve to forfeit your life. But the fact of the matter is that the way the death penalty is currently carried out in our country isn't equivalent to murder. Most murders are relatively short. They're relatively quick. The victim does not see them coming, or does not see them coming for long. Whereas men and women on trial for murder, the murder trial will drag on for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. The person is in jail during this crime, very often in solitary confinement or in a separate part of the prison, so they don't get very much interaction with other humans. So capital punishment trials are much more like a prolonged kidnapping in which the kidnapped victim is constantly threatened with death, but is not actually killed for a very long time. This is, of course, torturous, and therefore it looks as if the torturous capital punishment trials are a punishment out of the proportion with the somewhat more benign offense of murder. Okay, that ends this introduction of Bedau's essay on the death penalty. As always, make sure that this is only a discussion of some of the important points in the essay, and you ought to make sure that you read the entire essay before you're completing your work. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.